As you'll recall, a couple days ago, I uploaded a video showing that there was a fake KCNA website, that it was essentially impersonating the Korean Central News Agency. Now, I decided to go ahead and take a better look at it and see some of the information that it was giving out. One of the things that it was reporting as news was that the DPRK supposedly had one of the worst suicide rates in the entire world. Now, obviously, this had me, very interested, given that it's very clearly an extreme claim. Clicking on the link, it takes you to an article by The Guardian, because apparently that's what the KCNA does, just link to The Guardian. Anyway, The Guardian has an article where it talks about how there's a really bad suicide rate in the country, according to a report put out by the WHO, that being the World Health Organization, and that supposedly, according to this study, it had one of the worst suicide rates in the entire world. However, I also know that the DPRK doesn't publish numbers on suicide rates, so I became very interested to see what the article had to say on the subject. South Korea's problem with suicide has been well documented, but a World Health Organization report has found that the problem is even worse in its northerly neighbor, making the peninsula one of the most suicidal regions in the world. The report, entitled Preventing Suicide, a Global Imperative, estimates that in 2012, 9,790 suicides took place in North Korea, with roughly equal numbers of males and females killing themselves. The report acknowledged that acquiring data was difficult and that it had arrived at its North Korean estimate by factoring in a range of statistically predictive factors. Analysts say North Korea may have been driven to suicide by poverty and the psychological stress of living in a restrictive environment. I heard the economic hardship was the main reason, but really for anyone who is gay or lesbian or has mental health issues, life in North Korea is really tough, said Sandra Fay, an assistant professor at Sophia University in Tokyo and author of the forthcoming monograph, Marching Through Suffering, Lost Survival in North Korea. Well, clearly that's a very interesting statement, particularly as it pertains to how they came to the numbers of suicides. So, obviously, the only thing to do from here is to go look at the actual study itself. These statistics show a very grim picture that would suggest all kinds of nasty assumptions about life in the DPRK. However, upon closer investigation, we can clearly see the number 4 in brackets in the column marked with 2 asterisks, which tells us that there's more information. At the bottom of the chart, in the 2 asterisk section, there is a 4th point which reads, no vital registration. Vital registration is essentially a vital record, which is the record that the government keeps of the life events of a person. These typically include birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death certificates. In some jurisdictions, vital records may also include records of civil unions or domestic partnerships. What the chart is saying is that it has no official sources of information regarding the suicide rate of DPRK citizens. Since this is so, where are they getting this information from? The answer is nowhere. There is no other mention of the DPRK in the document. This document has no other information pertaining to the DPRK. The suicide rate appears to have come from nowhere. Going back to the first paragraph of the Guardian article, there is the mention of another study, or at least other information about suicides, and some of them even pertaining to the DPRK. Now, when you go to that one, it talks about how there's a suicide every 40 seconds in the world, and talks about different causes of death, which includes suicide. That too links to a study, but it links to the study that we already just looked at. Now, you may have noticed that there was another column on the chart, age standardized suicide rates per 100,000 2012. That column has 3 asterisks, which lead to the words standardized to the WHO World Standard Population. In both articles, there is mention of a 2012 World Suicide Report that is supposed to give the numbers for the DPRK. Of course, neither article actually links to said report. The main source for these numbers and other information leads to a 2012 report on suicides globally by the WHO. The page does contain a graphic displaying suicide rates globally, which does include the DPRK. But you'll notice they've listed the DPRK and the Republic of Korea in the same category, or at least in the same range for suicides. This chart is a part of a section of the page titled WHO Global Health Estimates. The section says the WHO Global Health Estimates provide a comprehensive and comparable assessment of mortality, including suicide, and loss of health due to diseases and injuries for all regions of the world. The latest WHO assessment of deaths and causes is for the year 2000 to 2012. In addition, it also links to a study called WHO Methods and Data Sources for Country-Level Causes of Death 2000 to 2012. It also goes by the technical title Global Health Estimates Technical Paper WHO HIS HSI GHE 2014.7. Now in this study, it classifies the DPRK in Section D. This means that it got all of its information from another study, including the causes of deaths for many other countries as well. But then when you go to that study, all it's really talking about is fertility rates, infant mortality, casualties of war. There actually really isn't even a mention of suicide anywhere in the document that I could even find. There appears to be literally no source for these suicide rates absolutely whatsoever. And in fact, this study contradicts one that was in 2013 by the Unification Health Ministry, the kind of association that looks over the possibilities and whatnot of the unification of the two Koreas. And that's connected to Seoul University. And they actually said, their claim is that suicides are actually very rare in the DPRK due to supposed terrible punishments that people would actually receive. And many other sources also say that suicide is a rare thing in the DPRK. In fact, they have a specific statement where they very heavily criticize this claim, this actual paper from the World Health Organization. And they basically call them right out and say that they don't have anything which proves any kind of a basis for where they get their numbers on DPRK suicides at all. In the case of the DPRK, no such data was identified, and the statistical estimates for suicide deaths by cause were based on regression models that predicted levels of suicide based on data from surrounding countries, such as China, the Republic of Korea, and other Asian countries, adjusted according to levels of statistically predictive factors such as alcohol consumption, population density, average income per capita, average education levels, religion, etc. The estimates, based on what is expected in neighboring countries with totally different political, social, financial, and value systems, would be less than reliable, and the quality of these stats would be highly variable. Now, along with these perfectly very valid points, I would also like to point out that it has been a very long-standing part of the anti-DPRK propaganda that there is a supposed punishment for people who commit suicide. Essentially, the government comes in and kills or jails for 3 generations your family if you commit suicide. And this story has come from those defector statements that get passed around the internet quite a lot. However, I would like to quote one particular source that seems to have at least some legitimacy. Felix App was managing director for the Pyeongsu Joint Venture Company, the first foreign invested joint venture in the pharmaceutical field in the DPRK from late 2005 to February 2009. App told NK News that while in the North, he had inquired about mental illness associated with suicide, such as depression or anxiety. Although doctors saw patients with such symptoms or with a suicidal behavior, the percentage did not seem higher in comparison to estimates that I had from other developing countries, he said. So in the end, really we're left with a big absolute question mark. There really is no information available. In fact, these numbers created by the WHO, assuming they actually even went through some kind of metric or some kind of an analysis to try to get to these numbers, are completely unreliable. And frankly, they're completely ridiculous, because they don't even take into account things like universal health care and things like that, stronger sense of community. And the fact that culturally, suicide is looked at as a terrible thing. It's a terribly dishonorable act, according to North Korean culture. And that would certainly play into a factor of whether or not their suicide rate was high or not. You can clearly see that this study is completely meaningless when it comes to the DPRK. But it is also worthy to note that this same category 4 was also on a lot of other countries as well. The truth is that the DPRK doesn't do a very good job at all of keeping stats with regards to suicides. Because of the tremendous social stigma that's on the subject, suicides aren't recorded very well. And in fact, that's, that's a bad thing about the country. They really don't keep comprehensive records on people who have committed suicide. But this in no way, shape, or form is a justification for making up such absurdly wild numbers, all with the specific purpose of demonizing the country. And then with this, we are, of course, feel justified in pushing such inhuman sanctions on the country and causing, such worse conditions. And of course, as usual, it justifies U.S. imperialism. It justifies the militaristic approach that the United States takes to the Korean Peninsula, and justifies all the horrible things that it attempts to carry out against the country. But in the end, the truth about the DPRK will always come out, whether anyone likes it or not.